The movement in history condemned to damnatio memoriae is the one that more than any other radically challenged the arrogance of the master race that had ruled for centuries, from the classic colonial tradition, to the attempt by the Third Reich to radicalize it and apply it in the very heart of Europe. But there's no movement in history that can't be subjected to a similar process of criminalization. Take liberalism, for example. If we ignore the best pages written by it, the need for limitations on power, the rule of law, or its understanding of the powerful boost to the development of the productive forces and social wealth that can come from the market, competition, and individual initiative, and we concentrated exclusively on the fate suffered by the colonial peoples or those of colonial origin, for centuries subjected to enslavement, to the more or less brutal forms of forced labor and genocidal practices and even holocausts. According to the term increasingly used by historians, even liberalism can be read in a more or less criminal perspective. In the current climate of the War on Terror, there's certainly no lack of books that, in referencing the horrific suicide attacks in Beslan, Russia in 2004, reconstruct the expansion of Islam as a history of a bloody and cruel conquest, that savagely rules over the defeated and only leaves behind a trail of blood. The role of Islam in the creation of the grand multi-ethnic and multicultural civilization that characterizes Spain before the Christian reconquest is hidden and forgotten, as is its radical questioning of caste society in India, and more generally of its promotion, beginning in the 19th century, of the emancipation struggle by colonial peoples. In the opposition direction, however, we can cite the publication of the monumental criminal history of Christianity, completely dedicated to denouncing the intolerance and violence inherent to its pretension of knowing the only true God. It contains an angry condemnation of the Crusades of extermination, the religious wars, the Inquisition, the witch hunts, the legitimization of the West's colonial expansion and the horrors in its wake, the support given even in the 20th century to tyrannical and bloody regimes. 1036 And again resourcefulness is combined with a mission, preaching the idea of equality between men, and as late as the 18th and 19th century feeding the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement. Christianity is an essential part in the formation of the democratic society. In his lucid hatred, Nietzsche understood this well. It was precisely for that reason that he denounces the intrinsically violent and criminal impulse that, despite its appearances, characterizes Christianity and the early Judaism of the prophets, rallying around the idea of equality and against wealth, power and the status of masters in general. The Jewish prophets would be first among those responsible for the massacres that took place during the Peasant Wars, the Puritan Revolution, the French Revolution and the Paris Commune. A line of continuity which 19th-century antisemitism and Hitler extend to the communist movement and the Judeo-Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. Moreover, the communist movement was quite often compared to early Christianity or to Islam. Thus, this depiction of universal history, understood as the universal history of crime, is almost complete. That sequencing of crimes not only avoids their motivations, but also the reasons for their uninterrupted duration, such that history as a whole is portrayed, as Hegel would say, as a slaughterhouse of planetary dimensions, 1037, or as an immensely unfathomable mysterium iniquitatis. At this moment, we can observe, like Gramsci, the past as such looks irrational and monstrous to us. History as a whole is portrayed as a grotesque succession of monsters, as teratology. 1038 opposing the reduction of the events that began with October 1917 to a crime or to criminal madness. Authors and figures committed in some way to defending communism's honor react, at times, by distancing themselves from the darker pages of that movement's history and branding them as the betrayal or the degeneration of the original ideas of the Bolshevik Revolution and the teachings by Lenin and Marx. Looking closely, that approach also leads to an outcome not very different from that we just finished analyzing. Are all the pages ruthlessly described in the criminal history of Christianity examples of betrayal and degeneration? How about the Reformation and the regimes that later side with Protestantism? Following that line, Cromwell is a degenerate in relation to the original protagonists of the Puritan Revolution, and the terror by the Jacobins is a degeneration of the ideals of 1789. Is modern Islamic fundamentalism a degeneration in relation to the Quran and Muhammad's teachings? Remaining coherent to this approach, anyone can consider the liberal West's enslavement and annihilation of the colonial peoples to be a degeneration of liberalism. Therefore, the traitors would be Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all slave owners, and also Franklin, according to whom the uprooting of those savages has been planned by Providence, for the purposes of clearing space for the cultivators of the land. Locke should also then be classified as a traitor to liberalism, as he is generally considered the father of that line of thinking, and not only did he legitimize the expropriation of the Native Americans, but he was also, as observed by an eminent scholar, the last great philosopher who sought to justify absolute and perpetual slavery. Proceeding in that way, we thus transform the pantheon of the great figures of liberalism into a gallery of traitors without honor. That sort of argument is even more suspect if we consider the fact that, in the eyes of a great liberal theorist of slavery like John C. Calhoun, it's precisely the abolitionists with their Jacobinism and anti-slavery fanaticism who betray liberal ideas of tolerance and respect for property rights in all their forms. That approach isn't much more persuasive if we apply it to the history of Marxism and Communism. Especially beginning with the 20th Congress of the CPSU, Stalin is the criminal traitor par excellence. But it's necessary not to forget that those very champions of de-Stalinization are accused of betrayal and revisionism by the Chinese and Albanian Communist parties. In our days, the criminalization process also targets Lenin, Mao Zedong, Tito, without even mentioning Pol Pot, and not even Ho Chi Minh and Castro are spared. A truly miserable outcome is reached by relying on the category of betrayal. The history of the communist movement as a crime in itself, triumphantly written by the ruling ideology, is simply rebranded, by those who are unable to identify with the ruling ideology, as the history of betrayal of its original ideals. Not all that different results would be reached in the reading of liberalism or Christianity if we wanted to describe their darkest chapters as the betrayal of their original ideals. To conclude, the approach criticized here commits the mistake of erasing the real and profane history, which is substituted by a history of the unfortunate and mysterious corruption and distortion of doctrines elevated a priori to the status of purity and holiness. Theory is never innocent, however. The reading of Soviet Russia's history in terms of the betrayal and degeneration of its noble original ideas is, most of the time, dismissively rejected by modern historiography, deeply committed not only to the collective criminalization of the Bolsheviks, but also in denouncing the authors that inspired the Bolsheviks as the original theorists of the terror in the Gulag. While it's necessary to avoid drawing hard lines of continuity and mixing up quite different kinds of responsibility, it is nevertheless permitted and even obligatory to question the role played by Marx and Engels, rejecting the myth of their innocence and investigating the real history of their impact and the reasons for that impact. But then it's necessary to take a similar approach toward all the great intellectuals, including those who are placed within a different and opposing intellectual tradition. Take Locke, for example. Is there a relation between his refusal to extend tolerance and even compassion to the Papists and the massacres the Catholics suffered in Ireland? And what of the underlying connection between his theoretical justification of slavery in the colonies and the slave trade, and the tragedy suffered by blacks, that which some African Americans today prefer to call the Black Holocaust? We can also turn to the time of Marx and Engels. Must a theorist, like John Stuart Mill, of the West's despotism over the lesser races and the beneficial nature of slavery imposed on savage tribes alien to work and discipline, be considered in part responsible for the terror and massacres that accompany colonial expansion? Not a single movement or person can escape those questions. We saw Nietzsche refer to the fiery tirades against power and wealth by the Jewish prophets and founders of the Church to explain the destructive and bloody nature of the revolutionary cycle. In the opposite direction, those that denounce the protagonists of crusades as traitors to Christianity would do well not to overlook a commonly neglected detail. An integral part of that religion's holy scriptures is the Old Testament, which legitimizes and celebrates the Lord's wars even in its cruelest forms. In this case, it's also misleading to counterpose the nobility of the original ideas to the mediocrity and the horrors of its real history. Having confirmed theory's non-innocence, it's a matter of identifying the different levels of responsibility. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the bodies of black slaves were branded with the letters RAC, the Royal African Company, in which Locke was a shareholder. The least that one could say is that the authors of the manifesto of the Communist Party didn't profit from the forced labor that, a few decades after their deaths, will characterize the Gulag. Marx and Engels can be accused of having legitimized in advance violence that, at any rate, will be put into practice after their deaths, and with decades separating them. Mill, however, legitimizes practices that are contemporary to him. Similarly, in Tocqueville we can read the explicit recommendation of colonial practices that are more or less genocidal that don't refer to the future, but the immediate present. 1039 In other words, regarding the atrocities of colonialism that take place under their watch and, at times, with their direct approval, the representatives of the liberal tradition cited here have much more direct responsibility than that attributed to Marx and Engels regarding the shameful aspects of the Soviet regime and Stalinism. While the path that leads from Marx to Stalin and the Gulag is problematic, bumpy and at any rate mediated by totally unpredictable events like World War II and the permanent state of emergency, it's immediately evident the link that connects Locke to the slave trade or Mill and Tocqueville to the forced labor imposed on the indigenous people and the colonial massacres. As a theory, neither can utopianism claim any innocence. Liberals are correct on that point, though unfortunately they resort to that argument in a dogmatic way, applying it only to their adversaries and not to themselves. What were the terrible human and social costs of the utopia of a self-regulated market, with a subsequent rejection of any state intervention, a utopia to which Britain was loyal to even when, around the middle of the 19th century, a disease destroyed the potato harvest and the subsequent famine consumed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Irish people? Or, to give a more recent example, how many catastrophes were provoked and continue to be provoked by the utopia, supported by Wilson even before Bush Jr., as well as by prominent modern philosophers like Popper, of a permanent peace to be achieved by spreading democracy around the world through the force of arms? To avoid falling into that very dogmatism, a similar question is also raised in relation to the history of the Soviet Union. There are, of course, those that read the history of the country born out of the October Revolution by lamenting the gradual betrayal of the ideals elaborated by Marx and Engels. In reality, and in certain aspects, it's precisely those original ideals, the millenarian hopes for a society without a state and juridical norms, without national borders and without the market and money, where there's ultimately no real conflicts at all, that played a harmful role, obstructing the transition to a state of normality and prolonging and intensifying the state of emergency. Despite their differences, the two approaches criticized here, that respectively base themselves on the category of crime or betrayal, have a shared characteristic: they have a tendency to focus their attention on either the criminal or the treacherous nature of individuals. In fact, they refuse to understand the real historical development and historical effectiveness of the social, political and religious movements that have a worldwide ability to draw people in and whose influence unfolds over quite a long period of time. Such an approach also proves to be inconclusive and misleading with regard to the Third Reich. It's way too easy to exclusively blame Hitler for the atrocities of Nazism, suppressing the fact that he extracted from the world that preceded him, and then radicalized, the two essential parts of his ideology: the celebration of the white race's colonial mission and the West itself, now called upon to further extend its dominion into Eastern Europe, the understanding of the October Revolution as a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that, in encouraging the rebellion by the colonial peoples and undermining the natural racial hierarchy and, more generally, infecting society like a pathogen, constituted a frightening threat to civilization, to be confronted using all means, including the final solution. In other words, to comprehend the genesis of the Third Reich's horrors, it's not a question of reconstructing Hitler's childhood or adolescence, nor does it make sense to start with Stalin's very beginnings to analyze an institution that has its roots in the history of Tsarist Russia and which, in ways that are always different, of which the countries of liberal West also made use, both during periods of colonial expansion as well as during the state of emergency caused by the Second 30 Years' War. Similarly misleading would be wanting to explain slavery and the decimation and extermination of the Native Americans based primarily on the individual characteristics of the U.S. Founding Fathers, or seeking to explain the strategic and atomic bombings of German and Japanese cities through Churchill's, Roosevelt's and Truman's perverse nature. It would be equally unreasonable to seek to explain the horrors of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib by starting with Bush Jr.'s adolescence or childhood. But let's return to Stalin. Is it a case of moral indifference to reject the approach that interprets everything as a crime or as the betrayal of the original ideals? Historians today still debate individuals and events that go back nearly 2,000 years. Must we unhesitatingly accept the sinister portrait of Nero traced by both the senatorial aristocracy and by the Christians? In particular, must we accept without question the Christian propaganda that accused the Roman emperor of having started a fire in Rome in order to blame and persecute the innocent followers of the new religion? Or, as suggested by some scholars, was it possibly started by fundamentalist and apocalyptic tendencies within early Latin Christianity, which sought to see reduced to ashes the place par excellence of superstition and sin, and to accelerate the fulfillment of their eschatological hopes? 1040 Let's skip ahead a few centuries. Regarding the large-scale anti-Christian persecution unleashed by Diocletian, historians continue to ask themselves if it was only the result of an inexplicable religious hatred that was alien to Roman traditions, or did genuine concern regarding the future of the state play a role, as its military was being undermined by Christian pacifist agitation, precisely at a time when the danger of barbarian invasions became more threatening? The historians who ask those questions are hardly accused of wanting to downplay the persecution that Christians endured, or of wanting to again send them to the beasts and to the most heinous forms of torment. Unfortunately, it's easier to critically analyze the sacred history of Christianity than it is to express doubts regarding the sacred aura that usually surrounds the history of the West and the country that leads it. Due to it being much further in the past and its much smaller impact on the interests and passions of the present, it's much easier to understand the motives of those who were defeated by Christianity than to identify the motives of those whose defeat cleared the way for the triumph of the American century. And that explains the heavy influence of demonization and hagiography in the understanding of the 20th century, as well as the stubborn popularity enjoyed by the negative cult of heroes.